Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to today's webinar on what is a low GMAT or GRE score and how to overcome it. So I am going to share my screen and we'll go over a PowerPoint slide together. And so again, this is what's a low GMAT GRE score and how to overcome it. Just a little bit about me before I get into the meat of this this presentation. I got my BA in economics from Duke University with a minor in chemistry. And I was fortunate during that time to become a manager for the basketball team. I served in that role for all 4 years. And because of that experience in sports and entertainment, I ended up getting the bug to wanting to work in media and entertainment. So I worked or interned for the Atlantic Coast Conference right after college. And that led me to one of the best jobs that you could ever hope to have, which was to work at ESPN in programming. And I worked there for 4 years. And programming were kind of the business arm of the school. Of the company. So we're the ones who negotiate with the various leagues for the right to televise their content, and then we figure out how best to monetize all of that content. And because of that experience, I realized that I wanted to branch out and do this kind of stuff for myself, where I'm developing my own content and managing the business for them myself, rather than giving that power up to somebody else. And so I decided to get my MBA. I applied to 7 schools and ended up attending the Yale School of Management, which I absolutely loved. Got my MBA in marketing and leadership. And I was an admissions interviewer and student ambassador during my 2nd year. After I graduated, I did found my own production company, Trey Mojo Productions, where I develop my own content ideas and sell that. And I've been in admissions consulting with Veritas Prep for over 10 years now. So that's where I get some of the expertise that I'm going to be imparting onto you today. And just one quick plug before we get into the actual presentation. There are free MBA admissions phone consultations through Veritas Prep if you follow this link, which we will also put in chat. And so, in order to fully understand what is a good score and how to overcome it, I first want to talk to you about why do schools care about GMAT or GRE scores. So number one, good scores show you can handle the coursework. GMAT, GRE, or even the EA help admissions committees predict whether or not you can actually stay in the program and thrive. And top MBA programs are quant heavy, and subjects like finance, economics, and strategy have a similar mindset and cover similar material to what's in these different tests. And so they're just using these. Yes, the test is just one data point in a sea of data points to help the admissions committee determine whether or not you're a fit, but it is an important data point because it predicts whether or not you can be successful. Number two, average scores drive MBA rankings. Applicants and recruiters care about rankings, so the admissions committee members have to also. And higher score averages help to increase the rankings. It's some weight depending on which service you're looking at or which ranking you're looking at. They provide a certain weight to the average GMAT or GRE scores. And so that helps to solidify where they are in the ranking. And test scores also matter to prospective employers. Not all prospective employers, but some. Finance and consulting firms use scores to decide who to interview. And in terms of the GMAT score range, as I'm sure you all know, the lowest that you can score on the GMAT is 200, and the highest you can score, the perfect score, is an 800. Now, if you look at all people in the world who take the GMAT, they average a 564, just under 565 on the GMAT. So I know that a lot of you are probably looking at applying to top schools. And so if you're looking there, you're seeing a lot of higher averages. And so that can make you feel like you're not doing well on the GMAT. But keep in mind that out of all the people taking it in the world, 565-ish is where most people are lying. And if you look at those percentiles, if you score a 650, 73% of the world scored at or below your 650. So don't feel bad if you don't have the top score about your performance. It may not be where you're trying to score in order to get into the schools, but keep in mind that you are still doing well even in that range. And looking at the GRE score, ETS provided the data a little bit differently than GMAT did for the GMAT. But out of all people taking the GRE in the world between 2016 and 2019, on verbal, they averaged about a 150, and on quant, a 153. If we look on table 2 on the right, in general, people applying to business, which I assume is where most of you on this webinar are applying, the averages are slightly higher. Verbal, you're at a 151, and quantitative reasoning, a 155. So again, this is all people taking it in the world. So now we'll start to talk about what is a good score. So it depends. This is a frustrating and maybe obvious answer, but it does depend on where you're applying. If you look at the top programs in the U.S., 19 U.S.-based programs in 2018 had GMAT averages greater than 700. Almost all of them were top 20 schools. And in 2019, Stanford had the highest score at 734, the highest average score. And if you're looking at the GRE, top business schools typically have averages greater than 315. And in 2018, Stanford again had the highest score at 330. So this is just the data and kind of giving you more information on the data. Here are some average GMAT scores in the top 25 highest GMAT scores. So you see Emory at number 25 at an average of 684 in 2019, all the way up to Stanford 734. So these are high scores. These are top 80, 88 and so percentiles. So you really do have to be high to hit these averages. And we'll talk more about whether or not you need to hit the averages in a moment. But GRE, just to give you some more data, these are the top 25 average scores in 2018, 2017, and 2016. So Indiana in 2018 was the lowest average score at 315, all the way up to Stanford at the 330. So that was mostly just a data dump to kind of give you the context. But in terms of determining a good score, the average score is not actually what you're targeting, because for that to be your average score, obviously half of the admitted students scored above that, and the other half scored below that average. So really, you want to target that middle 80% range, because that's more indicative of where most of the student body scored. And so you have 10% of the admits above that middle 80% range and 10% lower than that range. And obviously, that should be obvious, but a lot of applicants overlook that and kind of ignore that 10% is higher than that 80% range. And it gives some false hope on that. But really, you're shooting, again, for middle 80%. And GRE scores are accepted with no prejudice. That is a very much accepted test for MBA programs. And you want to still shoot for the middle 80% there. And just so you know, I will be answering questions throughout. So if in chat, during the live chat, you have questions, feel free to post them. But in terms of some data on middle 80% ranges for the GMAT, You see that Stanford's middle 80% is in that 680 to 770 range, and you work your way down to Stern, that's in the 660 to 760 range. So again, these are higher scores that you're targeting for these top programs, but they are doable. Obviously, you get a fair number of applicants who are able to get there. So what if you don't get in that middle 80% range? What are some of the things that you can do to overcome that? Number one, yes, that is obvious, but we will talk about that in a little detail. Retake the exam. Number two is to switch to a different test. Number three is to take a quantitative course. Number four is to leverage demonstrated skills elsewhere. And number five is to consider applying to a different program. And so what do we mean by these? So for retake the exam, GMAT is the organization that administers the GMAT. So they estimate that 3/4 of applicants who retake the GMAT perform better than they did the first time. And so part of the reason for that, obviously, is the fact that when you're taking it the first time, you may not have been familiar with the material. And so just sitting for it that first time can help you to get more familiar with the test. So just a simple retake by itself can raise your score quite a bit. A lot of applicants sometimes are concerned about what it looks like if it looks bad that they have retaken the exam a lot. And admissions committees do not have issues with multiple attempts, not at all. And they're only really going to pay attention to your highest score anyway. And if you have a lower score and had the time to retake the exam, but you didn't, that is going to appear as a red flag. So you absolutely need to retake it if you have the time. And you want to spend between 100 and 120 hours of study over several months. And if your first take was based on self-study and you have the resources to be able to go seek out a tutor, you absolutely want to do that because the tutor can help you to unlock certain things that you may not understand about the test. They kind of unlock how the test is presented, what they're trying to seek, the kind of mindset that will help you to be able to solve the problems. Whereas self-study, even using a lot of the resources that are out there, sometimes can't get to that depth to help you get that score up. And so I see a question, are those 80% accurate? These were accurate, I think, about a year or two ago, the 80% numbers that I had. So if you're seeing more updated numbers, then go with that. I wasn't able to find a site that really aggregated all of the middle 80%. So if you go to each individual school's website, they'll have the most up-to-date middle 80%. So that's for Eric JJ. And so number two, in terms of how to overcome a low GMAT or GRE score, is that you can switch to a different test. Most applicants, even now, are still taking the GMAT. And so if you weren't able to score well on the GMAT, then you can consider trying at least the GRE or the EA, which is the executive assessment. The EA is a newer test, but it is one that offers an alternate format to the GMAT. And applicants without a quantitative background often perform better on the GRE than they do on the GMAT. And that's just because of how the questions are posed. It's still testing you on your quantitative abilities, but just does it a little bit differently than the GMAT. I think that data sufficiency section on the GMAT in particular is one that gives people a lot of trouble because it's not typically the way that we think in our everyday lives, whereas the GRE is a little more straightforward to a lot of people. And one thing I want to point out that's not explicitly on the slide is that schools do care a little bit more about your quant scores. I mean, as far as predicting your ability to handle the material, because they're so quant heavy, the quant scores tend to be a little bit more important as they are breaking everything down, even though it's the overall score that drives their rankings. And Vishal is asking, I have a good profile, but I don't have a GRE score. Will colleges consider my application? So do you mean, I'm not sure if you mean that you don't have any score, like you didn't take the test, or you mean you don't have a good score. But if you don't have a good score, there are situations where they will still consider your application, and we'll get into that a little bit more on upcoming slides as to what will cause them to still consider the application. So hang tight, and if I don't fully answer your question based on your profile, please re-ask with a little more detail. And most schools accept the GRE, and more schools are beginning to accept the executive assessment. Again, this is a very new test, the executive assessment. So there's not a lot of data. There's really no data on averages or middle 80% on that. But schools are starting to look into what that means for them and how they can use that to assess an applicant's readiness. So always check what tests your school accepts, the ones that you're applying to, because not all of them accept all three of these tests. Pretty much all of them will accept the GMAT, and these days all pretty close to all accept the GRE. So it's more the executive assessment that you're checking out. Now, if you have a lower score, you can take a quantitative course. This is in addition to or instead of switching the test or retaking. So a course can mitigate concerns with your score and shore up your skill set. Some popular courses for people in this situation are MBA Math, HBX Core, or something in statistics, economics, calculus, or accounting. Those courses can be taken online or just at your local college. It doesn't have to be some fancy school, just as long as you are getting those skills in econ, stats, calculus, or accounting. And MBA Math is, for those of you who don't know, is what it sounds like. It's an online course that teaches you the types of math that you will be covering in your MBA studies. So that's anything from calculus to statistics and so on. And they give you a certificate at the end that you can then send to the admissions committee to prove that you've completed this course. And HBX Core is something that Harvard Business School has created, and they have different modules that you can do. That's more like a kind of a mini prep course for business school. And some schools even offer conditional acceptance letters based on taking a quant course. That actually happened to me. I had a lower GPA in undergrad because of my basketball experience. It just took so much time with the basketball team that they wanted me to be able to prove that I could handle the material in business school. So I had to take an econ course over the summer after I was accepted. So if you preempt that by taking a course yourself, you're showing your dedication to being ready for the program and being within what they're looking for to be able to accept you. You don't need to actually complete all of these courses before the application deadline. You want to be able to show that you have a plan for it, though. And you can explain this in the optional essay that you will be taking whichever of these courses, when it will be completed, and that you'll be sending the transcript or certificate to the admissions committee once completed. And so that's something that can turn something that maybe would have been a denial where they wouldn't accept you into at least a wait and see if they like your profile. And so I'm going to take a quick look at some of the questions in chat before we move on. So I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but Shubham says, I have 4 years of entrepreneurial experience and 680 is my GMAT score. Is it good enough to apply in a 40 to 50 ranked school? So for that range, I think it is, and we will talk about that range of schools in a slide in a little more detail. So I'll speak to that in a moment. And Samya says, for U.S. top 10 to 20 MBA colleges, what do you think is a competitive GMAT score? So for that range, for that 10 to 20, scores start to become viable at about 680. That's the bottom end of the middle 80% for those for the schools in that range that you're talking about. So you want to try to get as close to 700 at least as possible, just to make it a little less of a question mark. But 680 is where those scores start to become viable. And Sharath said, I have a very low verbal score, but a Q50. I have a decent profile with 3 years of work experience. Can I apply to universities with this score? So I'd want to know your total score, even with the Q50. Obviously, the quant being a 50 is strong, but I want to see the context of the total score as well. The 3 years work experience, that's something where if your score is that low, you might want a little bit more work experience before applying. But, obviously that's something where a little more detail, if I knew your profile a little better, I'd be able to give a more detailed answer. But we'll talk about how work experience helps to mitigate scores again in a couple slides. So that'll speak a little more directly to what I'm saying here. And Sarani is saying, can you suggest which MBA program should I choose if I am currently working as an SAP functional consultant? It's an ERP system and have 4 years work experience. So I won't be able to answer that one on the fly because I would want to know more about your profile. Sorry about that. And so I am going to go on to the next slide, and then I'll look back at some questions a little bit later. So another way that you can mitigate a low test score is to leverage demonstrated skills elsewhere in your profile. A low score can be balanced with a higher GPA and even stronger career achievements. So if you have a strong GPA, then that's a feather in your cap. It shows that you can handle strong coursework and difficult coursework, especially if your undergraduate degree required quantitative work. Now, if you have a lower GPA, then it's going to be a lot harder to get in with a lower GMAT or GRE as well. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean that you want to put a lot of focus into retaking that test and studying and trying to get that score up. Now, I have had clients who are every bit as capable as anybody else with high scores who had low GPAs. It could be a similar reason as to why I had a low GPA because of their extracurriculars in college. And they also had a low GMAT because of difficulty with taking standardized tests. That's where it gets to be trickier. And what I do with my clients in those situations is really what we're talking about on this slide, is to focus on showing your career achievement and putting that low GPA in college in context of all of the extracurricular work that you were doing. On average, admitted students have about 4 to 5 years of work experience if we're talking about those top programs. And that's important to note because longer work experience can mitigate lower scores. So that's what I was talking about a moment ago with a person who asked about having 3 years work experience and a low verbal. So the longer your work experience, the less relevant your scores can be because you have more data in your career to demonstrate whether or not you can achieve good scores in school. If you don't have as much work experience, if you're only 2-3 years out, then all of a sudden your average GPA and your GPA and your GMAT matter a lot more. And admissions committees look for applicants who have been promoted throughout their career and have increased responsibility. So for the person who asked the question, since you are in entrepreneurial pursuits, it's a little bit more difficult to demonstrate that. because as an entrepreneur, you're not really being promoted. But if you can demonstrate some of the work that you've done as an entrepreneur and some of the achievements with your company and some of the growth and some of the deals that you're making, that's something that can help mitigate a lower score. And you also want to show quantitative work in your undergrad and professional career, especially if you have the double whammy of the low GPA and low GMAT or GRE. This is something where you can tell that narrative in the optional essay about all of the work that you've been able to do, all of the analysis, especially if it requires heavy computations. And this goes even if you're not in a finance career or accounting. If you can show where you still had to do quant-based work, even in something that on paper doesn't look as quantitative heavy, that can help to explain and demonstrate that you will be able to handle the work in business school. Because again, it's really the quantitative work that they're concerned about. They pretty much understand that most of you at least will be able to handle the verbal and communication skills. So if you can show that you can handle the math that's going to be done in your microeconomics course and your finance course and statistics, then that's the kind of stuff you can explain in this essay. And again, this may seem obvious, but it is something that you have to look into. You want to consider applying to a different program if you have a lower score. And so there's the person who asked about applying to a tier 40 to 50 school. So that is that tier 2 program that I'm talking about, and also non-US programs, because they will have lower GMAT and GRE averages. That is not a statement on the quality of the education. They have fantastic programs overseas and in that second tier. It's just that you have fewer applicants, so it's not driving the averages up. That's the only reason why the averages aren't higher or why they're ranked lower. And they still have strong alumni ties, particularly in whatever region these schools are located in. And another way to get around it is to look at part-time or online versions of those tier 1 programs. So something like a Michigan or even a Berkeley, a Haas, those part-time and online versions will have lower average scores and middle 80%. And so it could be a little more achievable to get into those programs. And the added benefit is that you'll still be working, so you're still earning money. You're losing out on the day-to-day connections and networking, but you still will get the same reputation, recruiters, and alumni base as if you went to the full-time program. So that's something to consider. So I'll just take a look at what other questions there are. And so I see that someone asked, top programs have test waivers. And what do I think about this? And so because of the pandemic, obviously there are a lot of programs that are offering test waivers. I didn't put that in a slide only because a lot of the programs that are doing these waivers is specific to this pandemic and the inability for a lot of applicants to be able to get a test date in person or even online. But that is something that you want to strongly consider as well, just because obviously if you're someone who's going to have a difficult time with a test, then you can, and especially if you have a strong profile elsewhere, then that's something that you can consider. I actually had a client a month or two ago who had taken the GRE about 5 years ago, and it was on the score was on the low end for these schools, and was applying to a school that had a test waiver. And so we made the decision to not include that test because of the waiver, because the rest of her profile is fantastic. And so might as well take advantage of the test waivers at this point. Now, if she had just taken the GRE a couple of months ago, then we would have made a different decision. But that test waiver, I think, is something to leverage, particularly right now, if that's something that applies to you. And so Eric JJ said based on the new 80%. So he's seeing new data where top 10 started, the bottom end of the middle 80% starts at 690. This is possibly going to be a higher applicant or larger number of applicants than in the past because of the pandemic causing people to delay their plans. So a 680 could be a bit more difficult to get in. As I said earlier, you want to really try to shoot for a 700 anyway, or even north of 700. 680 is a tough number based on the current climate, depending on what the rest of your profile is. So you want to really consider how strong is your GPA and how strong is your work experience. And again, you have time. So just the mere fact that you have time, if you've got a 680 now, or even if you have a 690 or a 700, just because you have time, you want to go and study and try to retake the test anyway. But if you're finding yourself in a situation where months from now you're still at the 680 and you're not able to get that score up, then you can either, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, consider a different test to see if that might be more advantageous to you, or you can do some of these other mitigation strategies that we're talking about. And just looking at the other questions in chat. And so I see a couple other questions about your current score as a 680 or 650 and that sort of thing. Again, because you have time, I think that what you want to do is retake regardless. So I'll also answer as if you're not able to get that score up in the coming months. So Rahul, you have a 650 and 12 years of work experience. So I think your 12 years of experience can help to mitigate in ways that maybe other applicants can't. But again, start by trying to improve the score. But if you can't improve it, and the GRE or the executive assessment, you don't fare any better in those, and that's where you want to really leverage those 12 years of work experience and talk about a lot of the quantitative stuff that you've done and have achieved to mitigate those scores. And I see Praveen says, I have a GRE score of 328. And the verbal's 158, quant's 170. What are my chances of Duke, CMU, Cambridge, Imperial? So those are good scores. So I think you have a solid chance. Again, it's going to depend on the rest of your profile. And there are no guarantees because these are all competitive schools. So even with good scores, even with everything being as close to perfect as possible, you can still not get in. That's always the disclaimer on these sorts of questions. But you do have a strong package there to offer, particularly if your GPA is decent. And before I go on to the next slide, I see Vamsi said I have pretty average undergrad GPA. That's a 3.1. Pretty decent postgraduate GPA of 3.6, but I have about 9 years of work experience. Do you think my postgrad GPA holds weight? I'm yet to give my GMAT. So yes, your postgraduate GPA definitely gives weight because it's a more recent experience of you within education. And theoretically, your postgraduate degree is in the field that you're passionate about and that you've been working in. That plus your 9 years of work experience will help to mitigate that 3.1 GPA. That will mean that you want to make sure that you get a really good GMAT score. I know you haven't taken it yet. So even though you have the 9 years of work experience that can mitigate, you don't want to have a lower GMAT and a lower undergraduate, even though you have that postgraduate degree and a good score. All right. And so we were talking about schools on that last slide as a way to overcome. And so I do want to talk about school selection a little bit. Schools are more than their rankings. So you don't want to pick schools just because they're highly ranked. And so the culture is very important. You want to make sure that you have done your research and figured out whether or not this particular institution is one where you will thrive. Will it give you the resources you need? And is it the type of learning environment and learning style that suits you? Because again, as I mentioned before, there are fantastic schools outside of the top 10 and top 20. So you want to make sure that you're picking the school that's going to help you the most. And so that may be, regardless of your score, something that's a little lower ranked or outside the box thinking. So you want to keep an open mind throughout this process. And will the programs have the proper resources available for you to accomplish your goals? So again, I touched on that a moment ago. And you want to do your research. So it's not just about knowing what their average GMATs or GPAs are, or their middle 80% for those. It's really about figuring out the types of programs they have, the types of courses you want to take, and how you can contribute. So it isn't just about what you'll get out of the school, it's what you can give to that culture and environment. And so there are a bunch of resources to get this kind of information, like Veritas Prep. We have annual reports on our website for several of the top schools. There are blogs and message boards like GMAT Club, student and professional ambassadors. So on the websites for the different schools, when you look at the clubs, they will have different students that you can reach out to and ask questions of and chat with, just to get more insider information. And once this pandemic is over, you can have campus visits in person. And these schools are also obviously doing virtual campus visits now. So these are the things that you want to get to know. And the more that you understand the school and the more that you can demonstrate a fit, both in terms of what you'll get and what you'll give back, that can also help to mitigate a lower GMAT score. So that's part of why I wanted to talk about school selection. Because once you can show how you can contribute and demonstrate how you'll be successful in this program and give back even after you've graduated, that can help a lower score to not look so bad. And again, I just want to plug the free MBA admissions phone consultation. And we'll put this link in chat again as well. And I will open it up to more questions. I know there are a bunch of questions still that I haven't touched on. So I will answer a few before we head out. And so I see Braulio said, I'm from Peru, 29 years old, 7 years of experience, and 1.5 years as a manager. Would a 680 be a good score for a top MBA program? So again, the answer, because we're in February, the answer for any lower score is study, 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 and retake. And if you didn't use a tutor before and you have the resources, you have the financial ability to get a tutor, get a tutor. But if months from now, when it's time to apply, you're not able to be above a 680, I think you're in that cusp where you can still try, but you really need to lean on, hopefully you had a strong GPA, and lean on your work experience and explain the quant heavy work. And maybe even the other thing for everybody is you can take those courses that we talked about, like MBA math. Admissions committees would prefer that you get a higher score, but taking one of these courses is something that mitigates if that's just not possible, because a lot of people aren't great at taking standardized tests, but they perform extremely well in the classroom. So if that's your story, that's something else that you can explain in an optional essay. And so Justin said, I've been studying for the GMAT for 5 months, getting 720 on the practice test with a planned test next month. Wondering, is there an easy way to determine whether GRE may be better for me in case I don't do well? Well, since you're doing 720 on the practice test, it looks like you're going to do well on the GMAT. And often the practice tests, you score a little bit. It depends on the person. There are people who score higher on the practice test than they do on the real test, and people who do the opposite. But a lot of times with the practice test is a little bit harder than the real one, or there's not the data to show just how high of a score you have. So at 720, it seems to me that you're going to do well on the GMAT. But in terms of figuring out if the GRE is better, the only real way to figure that out is if you take a GRE practice test. So sorry if that's a little bit obvious, but I think that's the only way to do it. And Jatin asked, I am stuck at 322. I'm yet to take my third attempt. Should that not be achievable? Should I switch to GMAT to better my odds and try to score 720 plus? So obviously taking a different test could be something that works. As I was just talking about with Justin, take a practice test on the GMAT and see how that feels to you. See if that seems like a more logical test. But my instinct is that if you're having a little bit of difficulty getting your score higher on the GRE, then the GMAT will probably be a harder test for you just because of the different style. There are people who find the GMAT easier than the GRE, but it's usually the other way around. So I'm not sure how easy it'll be for you to get a 720 plus on the GMAT if you're having trouble with the GRE, but it's worth looking into. And again, if you haven't worked with a tutor yet on the GRE prep on your studies and you have the financial wherewithal to do so, I would strongly recommend that. And I saw in some of my research in the past few days that people were able to quantify that the return on investment of getting a tutor and getting your score higher is significant because it starts to put you in range to be able to get scholarships, which bring the cost down. And so, that investment for a tutor is minimal compared to the potential return on investment going forward between the lower scholarships and the lower tuition because of scholarships, or even the salaries that you can get postgraduate. So really consider the tutor. I understand these are big money investments, but it pays off. And just looking at the questions some more. And does too many GMAT attempts affect the acceptance chances? I've already given 3 and did not get good score, planning 4th attempt. So no, as I mentioned on one of the previous slides, there is no such thing as too many GMAT attempts, with the exception obviously being that there are limits that GMAC puts on how many times in your life you can take the exam and how many times in a calendar year. But that's more about their rules for how many times they'll let you take the test. As far as the admissions committee, there's no such thing as too much. So take it as many times as you need to be able to get your score up. And if you're having trouble, you're about to do your 4th attempt, really take a step back and see and assess what it is that's difficult about this. Is it the fact that it's a standardized test in general and you're not great with standardized tests, or is it something about this test format? Is there something different that you can do in your studying? You don't want to just keep taking the test without having made any changes to your preparation unless you've assessed and realized there are no changes that you can make. But really try to figure out if there's something different you can do in your studying. And Eric JJ asked, why do I believe the pandemic had such a great impact on the pool of applicants? And what do I think about the 2021-2022 applications will it follow this year's pattern or become even more competitive? So there were a lot of people at the start of the pandemic who had planned to apply last year, like this time, or a little bit earlier than this time last year, but couldn't apply because they couldn't get test test dates. And then there were people who weren't sure if they'd even be able to attend school in person, and they didn't want to do it online because of the investment and what they're applying to business school for. They wanted to be in person rather than online. And so for that reason, a lot of people were putting off their plans, or even if they were accepted because they took their tests and everything before the pandemic started, they still decided uh, to not attend, and they weren't granted. In many cases, they weren't granted the opportunity to defer enrollment, so they're having to reapply, and so that's causing there to be a lot more people applying now, and to your question, possibly next year as well. A lot of people were expecting uh, the application season that we just got through to be one of the heaviest application periods in a long time. And because of the fact that the pandemic has dragged on and people are still concerned about being able to attend in person, that may affect this coming year's application cycle too, because people are still waiting. So that is going to be a little bit difficult to predict what the middle 80% or the average scores will be as a result of that. But that is going to make it competitive. And so that's why I keep hammering home retake the test, retake the test, retake the test, because we have the time. But the other strategies that we're talking about are for down the road if you're unable to bring your score up. Can extra, so Visek is asking, can extracurriculars help the application while having a low GPA or GMAT? And if so, what kind of extracurriculars? How is volunteering for a 5K weighed against being involved in lobbying the government? So really, yes, extracurriculars help. They want, in general, even when you have a good GPA or GRE score, the admissions committees care about your extracurricular activities. They want to see somebody who is engaged in the community beyond school or work. So you want to have extracurriculars anyway. But in terms of what kind of extracurricular, is really about what you are truly passionate about. They're not looking for something in particular, and there's not this formula for what they're looking for with extracurriculars. And if it looks like you are just doing an extracurricular because you think this particular one is what looks good to the admissions committee, that's going to backfire more often than not. So if you're passionate about the 5K and not passionate about lobbying for government, then you should do the 5K. And if you did not do extracurriculars during college, then it makes it that much more important for you to be doing extracurriculars now. So anybody on here, whether you've got a good score or not, if you don't have extracurriculars on your resume for your post-college career, you want to really start looking into that, into what extracurriculars you want to do. As far as, and it has to be meaningful hours. You don't just want like 1 hour a month. So if you're putting real hours, dedicating real hours. Now, as far as mitigating a low score, one thing I might recommend is if you have to do something that's quantitative based or kind of on the cusp of business school kind of material and you're passionate about it, then that's the sort of thing that helps your narrative. So I hope that answers your question. And Sumit says, I am 40 and have 11 years of experience, still looking for MBA. Will age matter for an admissions committee? And the short answer is no. I had a couple of classmates who were 40 when I was in business school, or in the general vicinity of 40. So it's not a deterrent. Obviously, most people will be in that 4 to 5 year work experience range. That's more about who's applying than whether or not they will accept you. You'll just have to be able to explain in your story why you're applying now and why you didn't, what makes now the right time versus previously or later. And I would also wonder if an executive MBA makes sense for you. And Annie Michelle Elizabeth says, how difficult is it to apply in round 4 in the April-May round and get scholarships in UK? I am in my way to retake GMAT, but isn't it too late? So the reason why round 4 exists is because they are actually still trying to figure out who they want to accept and round out their student body. So it's not too late. It is harder to get in a round 3 or round 4, just because they've already accepted most of who they're going to accept. So you really have to have a stellar profile in order to get in now. Now, if you don't have the best GMAT score, then if you can demonstrate your uniqueness, and that goes for any round you apply in if you have a lower score. It's more part of what I was talking about with that narrative you want to tell in your optional essay. If you can lean on your uniqueness and what you can bring to the program that others can't, that's the type of thing that can help you to get over either a low score or applying in round 4 in such a difficult situation. And Soham said, I got 570 in GMAT first attempt. Mock's average is around 600 level. I don't think I can get any MBA in US or Canada. And so you're seeking my view on that. You're a chemical engineer with 3 years in tech, BD, marketing, and you want marketing. So with those scores, with a 570, 600, it is a very difficult proposition. Now, one thing I didn't note, but is worth pointing out as it relates to your question, is that if you look at the total range of scores, not just the middle 80, but the total range of scores, Stanford has let people in with a 570, and Harvard's let people in with low scores like that. I think one year, I think it was Harvard let somebody in with a 490. These are the exceptions. They're not the rule. That's why I focus on the middle 80%. And why I didn't put it in a slide. I don't want to get anybody's hopes up and think that a 490 is good enough. That those people who got in at a 490 or 550 or whatever they got in at had to do everything else exactly perfectly. Now that could be you. So don't necessarily give up on your dream of going to a US or Canada school with these scores, but it will be difficult, particularly given that you have 3 years of experience, not more. And but the fact that you are a chemical engineer, typically someone with your profile has higher scores. So they're not just going to compare you to the general applicant pool. They're going to compare you to other engineers. So yes, you can try to lean on the fact that that you have this quantitative background, and maybe you're not great with standardized test scores. I'm not sure if that is part of your story. But it is going to be a little bit more difficult with an engineer's background to get in with a low score. But again, it has happened once or twice a year for the past few years. So if everything else in your profile is stellar, you can try for it. But it does mean that you're going to have to look at some other options, like the lower tier schools or some of the international schools where the averages aren't as high. And Praveen is asking, should I appear in GRE again to better the score? Current is a 328, Verbal's 158, and Quant's 170. And so that is a good score. But again, just because we have the time, if time were a factor, I might give a different answer. But since we're sitting here in February in round 1, they haven't even opened the applications yet. So as I was saying earlier, if you have the time to retake it and you don't, that can look like a red flag. So definitely retake it. But I understand if you're unable to bring that up. That's a good enough score to get in. So really, I'm talking about just trying to get an even better score because of how competitive this field is going to be. And so that was the last question I see in chat. I can stay another minute or so longer in case anyone else has any other questions. But again, this has been what's a low GMAT or GRE score and how to overcome it. So I hope this has been informative for you. And like I said, I'll stay just for another minute or so, but it's looking like everyone has had their questions answered. And it looks like people are okay with some of the answers I gave. I'm glad it was helpful. You're very welcome. All right, since no other questions have come through, I guess we will end it right there. So thank you for joining me for what's a low GMAT GRE score and how to overcome it. And it was fun. Hope it was fun for you and informative. And have a great rest of your day. So Cyan is asking, is it possible to get a scholarship with an average GMAT score? It depends on what you are on your total profile. Uh, it's going to be difficult, obviously, but not impossible. But it depends on whether or not you might be, if you're maybe a minority or underrepresented minority, it might be possible, but average GMAT score is going to be difficult to get a scholarship. And Vamsi's asking, I'm already enrolled in Veritas Prep for GMAT Prep. How can I get my initial MBA consultation? So you can go to this link. I just went back to the slide here. So if you go to this link, you can get our free profile evaluation and consultation. And if you have a particular consultant that you want to work with, we have profiles on our website. So you can also, if you desire, request a particular consultant if you want to move beyond the free phone consultation. And Pushkaraj, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name, will you get admission to Canada with a 650? 650 is possible in Canada because again they have lower averages and lower middle 80%. So that is definitely in the range for most of the Canadian schools I've looked at recently. But again, we're in February. Retake the GMAT. That's your first option. Study and retake. And it looks like you're asking a follow-up to please elaborate on selecting a 1-year or 2-year MBA for working experience with 5 years experience. So a 1-year or 2-year MBA is more about what you wish to get out of the program. The GMAT averages aren't necessarily going to be that different between a 1-year or 2-year MBA. So what kind of experience do you want, and what are you trying to get out of the program is the bigger question for you. And Rohan is asking if I can comment about the whole Indian male above average GMAT expectation. I think that's more specific than that. If you come from an Indian male engineering background, that profile tends to have higher GMAT averages. And so therefore, as you're getting evaluated, you're being evaluated based on that pool. But if you don't have that engineering background, then I think it's a different expectation. And Vamsi, how can I work with you? So if you reach out to Veritas Prep using this link, you can request me specifically or request any consultant specifically if you want to work with any particular consultant. And GPA calculations for Indian students. I'm not sure that I'm fully qualified to answer that question, but it's similar to what I was saying before about the whole Indian male answer for Rohan. All right. So I hope that answers everyone's questions. And you are very welcome, Rohan and Vamsi. I think we're good to end the session. So thank you, everybody. It's been great. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.